Thanks everyone who's joined. We've just got more people coming in from the waiting room. And Amanda, are we good to start formally?
Yep, you're ready to start. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for joining today. My name's Steve Webb. I'm a director of ACTA, and welcome to the first of the 2024 ACTA Adaptive Platform Trials virtual clinic series. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today. I'm on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here today. I also want to thank the other three panelists, Cameron Green, who is the Global Project Manager of the REMAP-CAP Adaptive Platform Trial, Mitch Messer from the Telethon Kids Institute. Mitch is one of Australia's leading consumer advocates and consumer liaison people in relation to clinical trials and research. And then Professor Kate Lee from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, who is a statistician with a growing interest in adaptive platform trials. Our presenter today is Professor Colleen Liu. Colleen is a psychiatrist and professor of psychiatry at the University of New South Wales and the Black Dog Institute, with a particular interest in treatment-resistant depression. Colleen's been in a full-time academic appointment for almost 20 years. She's been highly successful in attracting competitive NHMRC and MRFF funding, with more than $45 million accrued during her academic career. A very experienced clinical trialist who's published more than 330 manuscripts. And Colleen, we're all looking forward to your presentation today about a proposed adaptive platform trial in, I think, treatment-resistant depression. Oh, and before we go to Colleen, we have to acknowledge our sponsor. This work undertaken by ACTA is funded generously by the Medical Research Future Fund. But now, over to Colleen.
Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to share today about our planned platform trial in treatment-resistant depression. I've actually kept the presentation fairly brief, just about 20 minutes, really just to brief you on the background, because we're really hoping to get a lot of advice today from a lot of you who have a lot more experience in this area than we do. We're really kind of novices in this area. And that at the moment, there are no existing platform trials in mental health in Australia. So we're hoping that this is going to be one of the first to be set up. Now, for those of you not familiar with major depressive disorder, which refers to a clinically significant level of depression, here are some of the key signs and symptoms as listed in the diagnostic criteria for depression. As you can see, quite a wide range of symptoms, and usually assessed by interview and also kind of quantified, if you like, by some structured rating scales. And of course, worryingly, it does include at the bottom thoughts of death and suicide, and when that is more problematic, including plans and actually suicide attempts or completed suicide. Here are some data from a recent survey in Australia. This is on the AIHW website, showing the relatively high prevalence of mental health disorders. This particular graph is for serious illnesses and looking at common serious illnesses in our society. And you can see that the combination group of depression and anxiety is really right at the top. The other thing that is very evident from the graph is how the prevalence has risen really here from 2009 to 2021. And if you focus just on the depression aspect, these are the prevalence rates that are cited in that AIHW report. Now, even if you look at a more, say, conservative estimate, if you say, well, maybe that's not a kind of a clinically significant depression that would warrant treatment with medications, etc. Even if you take a more conservative estimate of, say, 5%, that is 1 million Australians in a population of roughly 20 million. And then 1 in 3 of these people will have what we call a treatment-resistant depression. So that is depression that has not responded to 2 or more treatments, which are often medications and psychological therapy. So again, if you do the calculations, we're talking about, in a 12-month period, about 350,000 people in Australia of adult age with TRD. Now, TRD is a problem. It is difficult to treat, but also when you look at all of these outcomes compared to depression that is not treatment resistant, you see a higher all-cause mortality, and that noting that there often is a substantial associated suicide risk, as well as increased use of both outpatient and inpatient healthcare resources, lost productivity, and also high comorbidity. Here are the established treatments we have for depression that are available in most clinical centers, including most public hospitals. The newer treatments I'll subsequently shown you are by and large not available in the public sector. So psychological therapy, and these we've had for many decades, antidepressant medications, and where these treatments are not working, we have electroconvulsive therapy, which has been progressively improved and refined over the last 80 years, and has really up to recent years been the gold standard for treatment-resistant depression, and a very good treatment, highly effective, although it does involve a general anesthetic and some risk of cognitive side effects, depending on how the ECT is done. Now, how do we approach the treatment of someone with depression? So here are some kind of treatment steps outlined by the College of Psychiatrists practice guidelines, and that initially you might have non-specific interventions such as managing your sleep, your diet, your exercise. And then for those who do require some specific interventions, again, you might have so-called lower intensity, like internet-based options, or seeing a psychologist for one of multiple types of psychological therapy, and or going on to some pharmacotherapy. And there are a number of different classes of antidepressant medication. Now, if you don't respond to this level of treatment, then you now cross the line, as it were, to treatment-resistant depression. And the options here are now more complicated combination therapies, also TMS, which is a magnetic brain stimulation that has recently transitioned into clinical practice, including Medicare funding, and then ECT. And of course, ideally, one should not just slavishly start at the top and move down, but what psychiatrists are trained to do is to do a detailed evaluation. A standard clinical consult goes for an hour. And sometimes if issues are complex, we might spend more than one interview really assessing someone. So you might spend 2 or 3 hours to really get a good grasp of what the issues are. And from that assessment, you come up with a detailed formulation. So trying to understand what are the psychological factors, the person's personality, how their upbringing has contributed to this, what are their current social circumstances, including stresses, including supports, etc., and what are biological influences, their genetic predisposition, other medical disorders, and also the nature of their symptoms, because there are different subtypes of depression. So by putting all of these things together, that should inform an individualized approach to which of these therapies you use, and in what order, and where the focus lies. So that is current clinical practice. Now, here are all the new treatments, none of which are really available in the public sector. And my own research over the last 20 years has really focused in this area, new treatments for treatment-resistant depression. So you can see with brain stimulation, we are currently doing a pivotal phase 3 study of the new forms of ECT. My PhD work was in TMS, and that is now translated into clinical practice. TDCS has also translated into clinical practice from a regulatory point of view, although not from a funding point of view, and also not in terms of clinical availability. And then psychedelics, which include ketamine, often referred to as an atypical psychedelic, and a lot of excitement, some of you might have seen in the media recently, with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So here again, the idea is that the strategic combination of the psychedelic, which changes brain function, makes the brain more plastic, and allowing you to then maybe have emotional insights and process things that are blocking you from getting well, which were not previously able to process. And as you know, we are the first country in the world to have opened the door for mainstream psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy in Australia, with the TGA down scheduling of 2 treatments, one of which is psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression. Now, these are all really a new field of psychiatry, what is sometimes called interventional psychiatry, particularly in the US. And there's been a lot of momentum and growth in this field in the last 20 years. So for example, TMS, standard TMS has now grown into multiple improved versions. For example, with Stanford University having a patented new form of TMS, ketamine and some of the psychedelic therapies have been given FDA breakthrough therapy status in the US. As I said, the TGA has down-scheduled some psychedelics for certain indications, and there are a lot of commercial companies now developing multiple products in this space. We're also going to see an expansion of ketamine treatment in clinics around Australia, and this has already happened in the US to a much greater extent. So that's the good news, but what are some of the knowledge gaps that we face as clinicians when we come to treat people with TRD? One of the problems with the standard efficacy RCTs is that, as you know, we have kind of very highly selected study populations. So comorbidity is excluded, people who are too high suicide risk are excluded. So we end up with, people often at the lower end of severity, even within TRD, and who are kind of, neater from a kind of formulation point of view and overall easier to treat. I know myself, working both in the clinic and in clinical trials, that the people in our clinical trials are really a subset, basically the easiest to treat subset of the people I see in the clinic. So I might see, for example, a 50% response in a clinical trial, and then when we do this treatment in the clinic, it's more like a 10% response rate. Many trials are designed just to get regulatory approval, so compared to a control condition, but we then lack data on how these different novel treatments compare to each other in effectiveness, in safety, and in cost effectiveness. And of course, for commercially sponsored new treatments, they don't generally do comparative effectiveness studies because it's not in their interest to do so. They only need to demonstrate efficacy and safety compared to a control to get funded. Now, we also really lack data on outcomes beyond the short term, and I'm meaning more like sort of the 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. So we really lack data on how well do any benefits last. For example, with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which is now in mainstream clinical practice, nobody actually knows when you treat someone with this, how long they're going to stay well. Is it 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? Certainly when you look at the media, the public has the impression that it is a lifetime cure, which I suspect is not the case. We also then don't know what is the role for longer term treatment. When should it be done? How should it be done? Which treatment should we choose for which patient? And even within each treatment, there are multiple unanswered questions. So for example, even with ketamine, an incredibly effective new treatment for TRD, since the advent of ECT 80 years ago, I would say is the only treatment to have emerged in the last 80 years with that high level of efficacy that's comparable to ECT. But even within ketamine, there are many different ways of giving it. Even exactly the same compound, do you give it by subcutaneous injection? Do you give it by intravenous infusion? What difference does it make? And there are very few, hardly any direct comparisons. Now, a very important thing to bear in mind when we come to doing clinical trials in the TRD population is that we do face a considerable challenges. The first one is that we have a very ill and what is considered to be a very vulnerable population from the point of view of the ethics committee and the regulators, and also a very high risk population. And certainly you see anxiety, for example, in the ethics committees reviewing trial protocols. The people with TRD themselves, and you remember that list of symptoms I showed you at the beginning, by definition, they are not well. They have impaired concentration, they're anxious, they might be emotionally fragile, easily distressed. This means we need to be very careful, even from the point of first contact. Even the team member who picks up the phone for that initial inquiry needs to be very careful, skillful, very sensitive. For example, we've had people calling our team. You know, the opening line is, I'm feeling really suicidal, and I'm hoping your treatment can help me. Otherwise, there is no hope for me. So the pressure is on from the opening line. It means that we have to spend a lot of time and speaking with people very carefully. It is not uncommon when we recruit from the public for us to spend 20 hours of team time of screening to enroll one person. I think in some trials we spent even longer. There was one recent trial we did where we literally screened 50 people to enroll one person. And for most of those people, we would have spent an hour of screening. Now, distress at not entering the study is a problem. Again, I've been involved in all the major ketamine studies done in Australia in the last 5 years. Every single one has had a complaint about people being distressed at not entering the study. And one of the problems that I think we have to a greater extent in mental health and in other areas of medicine is kind of, self-diagnosis. So we have people who have very difficult lives. Maybe they've had a traumatic and difficult childhood and very difficult place in their life currently. They're unemployed, financial stress, have no friends, very little family support, etc. And unsurprisingly, they're also depressed and they feel depressed. So they might never have seen any clinician, but it's kind of, I have depression. I've heard on the media, for example, with psychedelics, this is such a wonder drug. People have said it entirely transformed my life. So they come to the study already with this conviction. I am depressed. I need this to fix my life. Now, as a clinical psychiatrist, if I were to assess this person clinically, I would be saying there's a very complex formulation here. There's multiple issues and contributing factors. I don't think just giving this person psilocybin-assisted therapy or ketamine or something else is going to fix all the problems, and it may not even be an appropriate treatment. The problem is that the person comes with this in mind. I don't think you have this problem, for example, say with renal failure. You don't have people kind of hearing about a study and saying, I have renal failure. Based on my symptoms, I know I have renal failure. Now, because TRD can fluctuate and there's always a component of suicide risk, we need to monitor people very closely. And it involves also a lot of psychiatrist time. So, for example, getting one person through a 4-week clinical trial might require 4 hours of clinical psychiatrist time for adequate monitoring, and is also required by the ethics committee. And it's also when you design trials, it's very tricky if you have a kind of a no treatment category, because again of these risks. Because of all of these reasons, it is very costly to do clinical trials compared, I think, to many other areas of medicine. We can't simply do an online screening tool and then have a brief, 15-minute chat and then enroll people. It's nothing like that. And the current cost when we cost our clinical trials is between $10,000 and $30,000 per participant. And we're only talking about the initial treatment phase of 4 to 8 weeks. So that is why there's very few clinical trials that go beyond the 4 to 8 weeks, because we're now talking about many millions of dollars, which investigator-initiated trials usually can't do. It also means with all the complexities and the costs that our studies have much smaller samples than what you see, for example, in cardiovascular clinical trials. We're talking about thousands of people. Having a trial with a sample of 200 is a whopping large study. For example, we recently completed our ketamine RCT funded by NHMRC with 184 people. This is the largest study of ketamine versus control in TRD in the world. I've been invited to present this as a plenary talk in international conferences because it is so significant. We were given $2 million by NHMRC, which was seriously underfunded. If it was a commercial trial, the budget would have been 6 to 8 million. The actual cost of doing this was probably closer to 3 to 4 million. Fortunately, we had a good coalition of very successful academic centers around Australia who really stumped up a lot of in-kind resources to run this trial, including hundreds of thousands of dollars of unpaid psychiatrist time. All site PIs were psychiatrists, and not a single hour of their time was funded. And yet this was a very successful NHMRC grant. At the time we got it, I believe it's the highest amount ever awarded to a single mental health clinical trial in Australia, and it almost scored a 7. The score was something like, I think it was about 6.4 in NHMRC. The only people who managed to do a trial of more than 200 are either commercially sponsored, and even then, they're not that large. So the patented form of ketamine, their kind of corresponding pivotal phase 3 RCT has about 230 people, okay? And that's despite, apparently their whole development budget, including the pivotal clinical trials, cost 500 million, compared to our kind of budget of 2 million. And then apart from commercially sponsored, the only people who managed to do trials, again, above the 200 sample numbers are people in the US, where their budgets would usually be $10 to $20 million instead of our $1 to $2 million. As a rule of thumb, they get about $10 for every dollar we get for clinical trials from competitive research grants. Now, the sites we have for doing clinical trials is also limited. Remember, I said that in our CAD study, there was huge subsidy from successful academic centers. It is very hard to do any study in a public center. For example, when I worked at a public hospital, I mentioned, maybe we could do some research, and that generated a very intense kind of reaction that will really make our system collapse, Colleen. And as you hear in the media from time to time, our public mental health system is very much in crisis. And there's also the issue of clinical practice variation. So even what is normal practice is often quite variable. So in this context, we are proposing to set up a platform trial for TRD, with the primary objective being effectiveness measured by a structured depression rating scale, and then also looking at outcomes of safety, acceptability, quality of life, tolerability, and health economics. The kind of the diagram is one that you all be very familiar with. Our domains are things like psychedelic treatments, including ketamine, neurostimulation, ECT, and other brain stimulation, different forms of psychotherapy, psychiatric medications, and there might be some future domains, so that people with TRD might be randomized between domains as well as within domains. Now, here are some of the kind of randomizations that might go into our platform trial. So you can see here, I've shown you just 2 domains, brain stimulation and psychedelic treatments. The trials that are currently already started are those that are shaded for 2024. So we are doing an NHMRC funded study of 2 forms of ECT and an MRFF funded study of 2 forms of ketamine, a generic versus a patented form. We're also doing some pilot work in psychedelic treatments. I'm about to put in another grant application for a first randomization and a platform trial, so that, hopefully sometime in 2025, we might have funding for a platform trial. Now, other comparisons that we are interested in doing, for example, psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy compared to ketamine. They both appear to be highly effective. One is about 3 times the cost of the other. Another one is oral slow-release ketamine. Rather than having to go to the clinic for every single treatment, This is a very promising new approach developed by Small Pharma in New Zealand, where you can have this treatment at home. You take a tablet twice a week. With psychedelic-assisted therapy, there are a lot of unknowns because it is very new. It's really sort of in the initial stages of research, although it's also been catapulted into clinical practice. And even what the therapy should be has not been systematically studied. Then some of these new interventions like ketamine and TMS, should you give them alone? Should you combine them with therapy? Again, that has not been systematically studied. And after the initial treatment period, maintaining response is also very important. What is the role of medications and therapy, and what types of medications and therapy or combinations might be useful in preventing relapse? So some of the questions we're grappling with is that we're currently doing some trials. We have grant applications under review for future trials, and we're planning to set up a platform if we get funded in 2025. But how do we kind of transition to this platform with the trials we're currently doing? Do we try to sort of roll them in, or just, for example, import the data? Obviously, with permission given in the consent form, which we are now building into all new trials, that your data might be imported to a later platform trial. But what is a common control group? Because you'll see even with these randomizations, there are completely different control groups and different patient populations. So, the population of people presenting for ECT, whom we're then recruiting for ECT type A versus B, are different to the people who will be entering, for example, the ketamine trial recruited from the ketamine clinic. How do we have a common control group? Now, here is the first planned randomization in our platform trial, and this is the comparison of ketamine and psychedelic-assisted therapy. And you can see here that ketamine is given in a very different way. It's usually given ongoing over what is shown here as a 6-month period, where psychedelic-assisted therapy, the idea that's a highly effective treatment with effects lasting for months. So there's only 2 doses of psilocybin shown in red, and then with the therapy sessions before and after. It doesn't look like much, but this costs about $30,000 to do this because of the intense therapy requirements and the number of therapists and how long they have to spend supervising people. This course costs about $30,000. This costs about $11,000. And we're grappling with, what even should be the primary outcome? When I talk to patients about treatments, they always ask me 2 questions in this order. The first one is, what are the chances I will get well? The second one is, if I do get well or better, will I stay well? So both are equally important, although it kind of makes sense to ask the first question of will I get well before you ask the second question of do I stay well? My hunch, for example, with this comparison is that both will show very good effectiveness after 8 weeks, possibly psilocybin being more effective, but that at the end of 6 months, that could be a different story because ketamine treatment is ongoing, whereas the psychedelic-assisted therapy was completed 4 months ago. And really, I have no idea what this will look like. And of course, you have the problem with dropout with this kind of follow-up period. And it brings me to one of the things we're grappling with trying to set up a platform trial for TRD. So even the acute treatment benefit, which is what most trials focus on, when do you measure the primary outcome for the acute treatment benefit? And the problem we have is that the interventions, and here I've provided some examples, have very different lengths of treatment periods. And indeed, for ECT, when you look at all clinical trials of ECT, there is no set time. There's no such thing as we do ECT and we measure outcomes at 4 weeks, 3 weeks, or anything. It's always the course of ECT and the number of treatments, the duration of treatment is clinically decided depending on how you go. And that's because I think of the risks involved, the general anesthetic, potential cognitive side effects. You're not given even a single treatment more than is actually required. So all ECT RCTs measure the primary outcome at the end of the acute treatment course as decided by the supervising psychiatrist. With TMS, we're looking at sort of 4 to 8 weeks. With psychedelics, there's quite a broad range. And if you look at the published studies, they're anything from about 3 weeks to 12 weeks for the primary outcome. And then with therapy, that is a kind of a headline for many different forms of psychological therapy. And so you have brief therapies, which only go for 6 weeks. You might have others that go for 6 months or even several years. Okay, so even this range is a kind of a conservative estimate of the kind of the range. So how do we have a common primary outcome at a set time point in a platform trial, given that our interventions have such different treatment periods? That's the first dilemma. Another critical issue is, what should be the primary outcome? Should it be at the end of the acute treatment period or at the end of, say, a 6-month follow-up period? And what is the critical question really differs depending on what intervention you're looking at. There might be some where we know it has a very good acute treatment benefit, but we don't know whether it's maintained. There might be others where the main question is, does this even work in the first place? We don't know. Again, because of cost and difficulty reasons, most trials have only been done during the acute treatment benefit period, which means that we lack maintenance and longer-term data. This is a problem. For example, Medicare-funded TMS only for 35 treatments because they said, where is your randomized longer-term data of the need for treatment? There isn't any. So that's the problem. And also for clinicians usually kind of work it out as they go, but then it becomes a problem in terms of having actual good quality data to inform policies, guidelines, and also the funders. We're very fortunate. There's a large number of institutions collaborating and who are interested in being part of the launch of this platform trial in TRD. Here are some of our core team in the daytime and at the nighttime. But now to leave you with a whole list of questions that for which we're hoping to have your wisdom. A number of questions. So one is, with our ongoing trials, do we try and convert them into a clinical trial or at least transfer the data? I've already spoken to the dilemmas we have with trying to specify the primary outcome, that for some comparisons, the important comparison might be the 6-month outcome. For others, it might be the initial treatment. How do we have one primary outcome for the whole platform? And even if we say, okay, we're going to say it's the acute treatment, do we have to specify an exact time point, like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, or can we just specify at the end of the acute treatment period? Some statistical questions, and I've put here the 3 people in our team who are particularly leading these statistical aspects, so you can ask them questions and they can comment further on this. There are all sorts of problems with longer-term outcomes, including people dropping out, so that we have a much smaller sample size. Given that our sample sizes are small to start with, and it's very hard to do studies of more than 200, does it make sense to do response adaptive randomization? Because we're not talking about thousands of people. Is it actually sensible to do? And how do people address chronological bias? That's common to all platform trials, not just ours. And then given the issue that the efficacy RCTs have been done in this very highly selected population, and then we have all these effect size estimates, but we are now, if we're doing comparative effectiveness trials in kind of real world clinics, should we be using non-informative or informative priors for our Bayesian analyses? And what kind of resources do we need to set up and run a platform trial? And then from a governance point of view, we are keen to make this a truly collaborative effort. So we are anticipating that different randomizations would be led by different investigators and their institutions. How do you do all of that within a single platform trial umbrella? What happens if we have multiple sponsors? Given that most people will want their university to be the sponsor of their study, who then owns and manages the data? How do you manage agreements, given that usually competitive funding is linked to a specific, say, NHMRC or MRFF grant, which then leads to an MIA linked to that specific grant and study? How does that all fit trying to have a single governance structure for a platform trial. So those are the questions, and I'll maybe leave it on this slide, which has the majority of questions for discussion.
Colleen, thank you very much indeed. We might actually take the slides off so that for the discussion we can see how people are saying what they're saying, as well as just hearing what they're saying. There is an early hand in the air, and I will come to you in time, David. I want to start by making three introductory comments, and then I'm going to throw a quite specific question to Mitch Messer. So the three introductory comments are, firstly, there is somewhere tucked away within the ACTA guidance around adaptive platform trials, which may or may not surfaced as a public document or being submitted for publication. But it's the sort of set of criteria for which defines a condition which we believe is suitable for an adaptive platform trial. And so those criteria are that there's a high burden of disease, because there's large central infrastructure costs that need to be justified. Secondly, that there is unequivocal unmet need for better outcome. And thirdly, that there are multiple component treatments, the effectiveness, comparative effectiveness, cost effectiveness of which is incompletely understood currently, and additionally, desirably, that there is potential for interaction amongst treatments, and there is uncertainty about optimal combination and sequence of treatments. So I want to start by saying that I think treatment-resistant depression ticks all of those boxes. The second comment that I want to make is, Colleen, you've thrown so many questions at us that there's no possibility that we will get through those in whatever length of time we've been available. But it strikes me that what is really needed, and it's something that I advocate when people ask about how to go about designing an adaptive platform trial, there's a whole day workshop with the biggest whiteboard you've ever seen, is what is probably necessary to try and determine a logical sequence for working through the questions. A third comment is that the clinical statistical structure of platforms, and the clinical statistical structure is that sort of how things like the primary endpoint, when you're going to measure it, how you deal with relapse and remitting disease, and what the domains are and what the strata are, is the sort of how you convert all of the questions that you've got, and they're very good questions, into a structure to go forward. But the specific question that I want Mitch to address is, Mitch, as a consumer research advocate, what's your advice to Colleen about the primary endpoint? Because I think the primary endpoint is the fundamental issue on which all of the other clinical statistical structure questions hangs off.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I was thinking about that actually as you were speaking, Colleen, when you were talking about that. I think you mentioned that the questions you get asked are, will I get better, and, will it last? And I think one of the things you need, I think that's where you mentioned you've got people with lived experience involved, or you said to me previously. I think asking the community, asking those people, what are the critical outcomes, is really important, I think, because I think patient relevant outcomes are what's really going to matter in this sort of trial, because you can have as a clinician a particular view that or that you think is important, but really talking to community and working out what they think is important will help guide you, I think, really well in terms of what you think the primary outcome should be in all of those those things that you talked about. So I would really make sure that I was really talking to the community and people in that. And you mentioned that none of those trials are big, but you have a large population of people who are affected. So there's those two bits, and maybe when talking to that population, you might get a better idea about what are the really critical things that they think are important and that would make their daily lives better. Because in the end, people with lived experience aren't so worried about the results of a test or whatever. They're wanting to know, what is the impact on my day-to-day life? Will I be able to work? Will my relationships improve? You know, all of those other things that we all carry on about every day, the rest of us. And I think that's really critical, I think, to working out the answers to some of those questions you were posing.
Thanks for that.
And so, Colin, if I could add to that, and this might sound a bit like a heretic, but I couldn't endorse Mitch's comments more. And I think it's a personal view. Researchers should be entirely willing to abandon the primary endpoints that have been used traditionally and conventionally within their discipline. In particular, not feel compelled in any way to follow the endpoints that have been developed and accepted by the FDA for regulatory purposes. I think there is if you're going to do this, the very first piece of work that needs to be done, and this would not have funding or be attractive for funding, is exactly the work that Mitch outlines of working out what's important to those with lived experience, and then secondarily taking the output from that process to psychiatrists who have to make treatment decisions and making absolutely certain that those outcomes would be regarded by mental health professionals as sufficient to change practice in their opinion. And when you have endpoints that meet those dual criteria, that becomes the endpoint that you work forward from. The second thing I want to suggest is, in most conditions where humans have lived experience, it is usually possible to create an ordered rank of those outcomes, so an ordinal scale. And if that's the case, a secondary question that's extremely important from a statistical perspective is, in the judgment of those who understand these interventions from both a clinical and a research perspective, do you expect the treatment effect of the interventions to frequently be proportional across the categories of that ordinal scale? Because if they are, you gain a lot of statistical power from converting what those with lived experience have said is important into an ordinal scale and using that as the primary endpoint. And I suspect that what those with lived experience say, but one should never make assumptions, is that avoiding suicide, avoiding the consequences of suicide, of having lives that are, Mitch said it better, but you know, there are people who you love, who love you, there are things in your life that you can do and enjoy, be it related to your social interactions or occupational activities or contribution to society. But that, I think, has the basis of an ordinal scale. But of course, what people want, and you've alluded to this, is not just to be feeling better in 8 weeks' time, but to be feeling better in 8 years' time. And that is going to take me to the second concept that I want to introduce from a platform trial design perspective, that I think there's a very important element of what is referred to in platform trial design as state. You will have patients who come to you with treatment-resistant depression, but you want to have the opportunity to assign new treatments to them when they relapse. And so if a person has a remission in response to their first set of treatments provided by the platform, they then enter a period where they're in remission, and you will probably want to have the opportunity to randomize them to interventions that result in sustained remission. But you then have a third state which occurs when they relapse, and you need to make new treatment decisions, all within the context of the platform. And sorry, Mitch, there was something you wanted to say?
Oh, there was a question that's come up while you were talking, Steve, just about the functional outcomes and other functional measurement tools that have been used in other trials. And I think the functional tools really need to relate to the condition that's being researched. And I know that at Beat CF, I'm involved in Beat CF, and one of the things we did there, we actually did a lot of work, is working with the community and coming up with a tool that we can use for patient relevant outcomes. So it was developed through a PhD study that was involved with that, so that we could do that, and that we were so there are ways you can develop that, and we used the James Lind Alliance approach to developing that. So
David, you've been extremely patient. David, I don't know if you're speaking, but you're still muted if you are. We'll come back to David. Kate, interested in your comments from a statistical perspective. Colleen has thrown no end of questions your way.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Colleen, for the presentation. I guess I was going to I had a couple of comments and some thoughts, some kind of answers or my thoughts on your questions. I mean, I agree with Steve that I think the disease area kind of would work as a platform trial. There's the kind of general comment. I guess I had a question really about your design as you flicked up there. It looked like you were trying to randomize to domains and then within domain randomize to an intervention. And I mean, platform trials typically have different domains, but then you're randomized to an intervention within each domain. So you might want to think about that, but in that case, you don't want too many domains and too many interventions within each domain, because you've got to think about then interactions between different interventions. So, you know, I think that design would work, but you just need to kind of think about it a little bit. And linked to that, in terms of your question about just rolling the trials you've already got into this platform trial, I would think about initially what you want the design of the platform trial to be and to look like, because it will take you, from my experience, a couple of years to get this up and running anyway. And then if the trials you've got fit in it, great, roll them in, but I wouldn't design it around those trials. I'd design it around what you want to do. And then just to answer some of your kind of questions more on the stats side, I think if you're going to compare different interventions, you want the outcome to be at a single time point. If you're comparing different interventions and and you want the outcome to be at the end of that intervention, and there are different time points, you're going to have problems with confounding by time. So if one of the outcomes measured at 4 weeks for one intervention and 8 weeks for another, the course of disease is different over 4 weeks and 8 weeks. So I think you would need a set time point. And as I'm sure you're aware, that kind of needs to be shortish term. If you're going to do any adaptations on it, those longer term outcomes are harder to adapt on. That doesn't mean you can't have them as secondary outcomes, but I think if you're going to do adaptive things, drop arms, do response adaptive randomization, you need to have that short single time point, shorter term outcome. I think what you can do with your
before we get, I've got a sort of supplementary question, I guess, to you and Colleen in relation to the time point at which interventions are measured for primary effectiveness. Colleen, is there a time point at which Clinically, a psychiatrist would usually say we've failed to achieve remission from the particular strategy that we're using at the moment. I don't know if that would be 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks, but is there something that people would regard as being relatively constant from a clinical perspective, irrespective of the duration of the intervention being used to induce remission?
So one of the problems, Steve, is that the interventions work at different speeds. Like ketamine works incredibly rapidly, and that typically by the end of 4 weeks, if we're not seeing an improvement, like it's a waste of time and everyone's time and money to continue. Likewise with ECT, if you're not showing much improvement in 4 weeks, there's not a lot of point continuing. Whereas for medications, 6 to 8 weeks is considered a good trial. And likewise for psychological therapy. So that's one of the dilemmas that we have.
So I'm not sure statistically if this can be made to work, Kate, but is it possible to specify a priori the time point by which you judge whether or not remission has been achieved for a particular intervention and regard that as the primary endpoint, even if the time point at which that's evaluated is different?
It's going to be hard, because if you expect remission to have occurred with one intervention quicker than another, then if you do a time to event, it's always going to be better.
Yeah, well, I'm not suggesting time to event, but I'm just saying that you have a primary endpoint that is defined as success or failure to induce remission at X time point, but you allow X to differ by domain.
Again, I don't think so. I mean, it's just a natural course of disease. If you think, if you did nothing or minimal, whatever, your remission, you might be more likely to be in remission at 4 weeks than you would be at 8 weeks. So I think you've still got this issue of confounding by time in the two different arms.
Indulge me to say you're just using a dichotomous endpoint, success or failure of remission. I still think statistically you could define success or failure at different time points.
But you can, but you wouldn't be able to distinguish if it was because it was a different time point that caused the difference, or because of the treatment itself. Like, I'm not a big, I don't know much about depression, but leaving it with nothing, you might expect to get worse at 8 weeks than you would at 4. So less likely to be in remission at 8 than 4, irrespective of whether you did the same treatment.
Without necessarily having any answers, but just saying something which is based on easy to say, difficult to implement principles, you want the clinical statistical structure of the platform to match very closely the clinical decisions that would be made in real life practice. Kate, I sort of interrupted you as you were moving to the second point that you were going to respond to Colleen about.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to be interrupted. I was going to ramble through my answers to most of her questions in a kind of quick fashion. So I was going to say, I think you're limited a bit in terms of what design you can do and how many domains and how many interventions by your sample size. So I don't think the sample size, you had a question on there about, can I use response adaptive randomization with the smallish sample size? I don't think it's not the sample size that's a problem for that. For that to be useful, you'd want at least 3 interventions you're comparing to each other. If you've only got a couple of interventions, it doesn't add any benefit. So responsive adaptive randomization is better if there's more interventions, but how many interventions you compare is going to be limited by your sample size. If you can only get a few hundred, you can't look at 16 different interventions, for example. So I think your sample size has got to play into what's available in terms of how much you can put into this platform. Then 2 other last quick things. The chronological bias, that's obviously a problem in platform trials, particularly if they're longer term, but I think you can model that statistically. So, that's an important thing to consider, and you don't want the trial to go on for forever, ever. And, you then kind of lose the information you get at the beginning is going to be less relevant to the information you're collecting later on, but you can model that statistically. So that's not, a no, it's not a problem as such. And then the last question was about the stats team and the stats support and how much you need and what they need to do. The main thing I would say is you need to get stats involvement now, ASAP. you need that, particularly all this design phase is where a statistician can really bring a lot of information. So I think whoever you're going to engage longer term, it's really helpful to get them involved in these early conversations and all the design conversations. It obviously has a lot bigger reliance on the stats than a standard trial. And in particular, you typically have to have, people who are blinded. Remember, part of the study teams, they can't actually be looking at the data at all. So if you're doing interim analyses or response adaptive randomization, you need different teams of people doing that than actually involved in these design discussions and ongoing trial discussions. So you've got those kind of, at least those two teams, and you obviously need more statisticians on the data safety monitoring committee who are kind of monitoring safety, but also the response adaptive parts of it and the adaptive parts of it. So the answer is quite a lot and soon. That was my kind of quick answer, Steve. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to any of those.
No, that's great, Kate. I just wanted to add one thing, Colleen, which is a small extension on what Kate was talking about. I think a really critical question in setting up the clinical statistical structure is identifying what might be regarded as mutually exclusive treatment options, because it is often mutually exclusive treatment options that define the interventions within a domain. There's no mandatory requirement that there's a common control group within platforms, particularly where there's a clinical and ethical imperative to always be providing an active treatment. It's entirely reasonable where you would be providing multiple treatments simultaneously, which I think is what occurs in this condition, to just randomize amongst the mutually exclusive treatment options, restricting yourself to active treatment options. Where a novel therapy comes along and you don't know the answer to the question, is this an effective therapy, then it's appropriate to add that as a domain with a no intervention control. Cam, does the operational logistics of doing this in patients who I think are largely in the community rather than in hospital, but at major risk of adverse outcomes, does that frighten you more or less than doing this in critically ill patients in intensive care units?
Probably more, to be honest. I think
I think that was the correct answer, Cam. I think that was the correct answer.
Yeah, it's a good question about. I mean, you've raised dropout rate, and I don't think I've got any sort of solutions for you there. But I think understanding from your potential patient population what they're interested in participating in and what they're interested in as an outcome from the trial will also help to potentially keep participants in the trial. There was a mention of response adaptive randomization, and I probably agree that with such a small potential sample size, it's probably not that useful. But also just from sort of an operational perspective, there are things that response adaptive randomization makes quite difficult. So for example, I'm blinded to how many patients are being allocated to each intervention within REMAP-CAP, because knowing that might give some idea about how different things are performing. And so things like providing drugs to sites or to, in your case, to clinicians might be quite challenging if you're undertaking response adaptive randomization. So that's just another consideration, that there are operational things that it makes a little bit harder. Another thought that I had was just around health economic evaluation. There seemed to be a big difference in the cost between some of these interventions, and so that might be something that's also important to look at. And then it might be a bit of a naive question, but it seems you talked about treatment-resistant depression and these participants having already been through a couple of potential therapies. Will you account for which therapies they've potentially failed before they get to the trial and sort of make sure that they aren't allocated to the same types of things once they're randomized?
That would be important, yes.
Colleen, we are now at the top of the hour, and I feel like we could probably do at least, until the sun goes down in Western Australia on this, and still only just be starting to scratch the surface. I just want to make comment that, David, thank you for putting your questions into the chat. I think the answers to those questions did ultimately emerge from the discussion. Indeed, I would agree with the answer that you put forward in relation to that issue. Colleen, I wrote down a couple of pages of notes whilst you were talking. I think there are really important issues around stratification that we haven't discussed, but that relates to the issue that you outlined, where in the registration trials, it's typically patients at the less severe end of the spectrum who end up in trials. And so one possibility is to stratify by severity, which means that if there's heterogeneity of treatment effect by baseline severity, you end up with an independent answer that applies to each stratum of severity. Whereas if the treatment effect is similar across stratum, you conclude each stratum more quickly by borrowing between them. And the other was we've left completely untouched what I think is a really important issue that you raised around heterogeneity of treatment effect. My understanding is that I think Michael Burke once, and Michael's probably my major source of knowledge about psychiatry, which is close to zero, but he said 1/3 of patients respond to treatment well, 1/3 of patients have a partial response and 1/3 don't respond, and that applies to all psychiatric illnesses and all psychiatric treatments. But that sounds like the sort of scenario in which having a better understanding on which baseline characteristics are associated with a beneficial treatment response would be extremely useful information from a clinical perspective. So tantalizingly, I just leave with you that that is something that the platform can generate, but it needs to be planned in advance. But at that point, Colleen, have you got any immediate questions or comments that you want to come back to the panel about?
No, it's been tremendously useful. I just get the sense there's a lot more work to be done and consultation. And as Dan put in the chat, it's kind of a challenge of how do we actually achieve that? Do statisticians grow on trees? I think was the gist of it.
Yes, no one's responded to my facetious comment that it's a berry tree, is the tree on which they grow. It is undoubtedly the case that there is a major disconnect between the availability of statisticians that can work in this space and the need for those statisticians. However, I think that is changing, and it'll change gradually and then it will change suddenly. And I don't think it's a reason not to be planning and working on these. I didn't mean it in any way facetiously. I actually think this is a very, very good disease for a platform, and would suggest that in addition to launching the work that Mitch was outlining, it really would be that a whole day in a room with a big whiteboard would be your best next step forward.
Thank you for that. If any volunteers to join us, we'd be very happy to have you.
And in fact, that in the room, making sure you've got all the people in that room, as Steve said. I know that's what we actually did with BCF. We had a couple of days where there was everybody in the room with the whiteboards. So,
and what that does need, Colleen, is people who have lived experience of the disease, as per Mitch. And I'm sorry, Mitch, lived experience of running a platform because that's a group with a relatively unique experience additionally.
Any volunteers?
Look, we might.
Thank you.
We might. Thanks, Colleen. I think my internet was a bit slow there. Look, we might wrap at this point. Colleen, my suggestion would be speak to people who might be able to assist get that workshop done. And what I'd like to suggest is that it might be a great opportunity to come back in 4 or 6 months' time and re-present to this group with a sort of a straw dog type structure for feedback.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Colleen. Wonderful presentation and a great discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.